I didn't know that my visit to Uncle Ray would result in events I wasn't prepared for. Growing up, I had always looked up to him. He was the charming uncle who brought me Christmas gifts wrapped in shiny paper, his laughter lighting up every family gathering. Now, here I was, standing at his doorstep, fresh out of college, eager to surprise him and relive the warmth of those memories before we go further. Ensure to like, share, and subscribe so you won't miss any of my confessions and true stories like this one. I stood on the porch, clutching my suitcase, as the countryside's golden evening light cast a warm glow around the house. The familiar sound of birdsong in the distance mixed with the faint rustle of the trees. Uncle Ray opened the door, his face lighting up with the same charm I remembered. His smile was kind and genuine, but there was something about the way he looked at me, soft, almost contemplative, that spoke of quiet appreciation and surprise. "You didn't tell me you were coming," he said, stepping forward to pull me into a warm, familiar hug. His embrace was strong and comforting, carrying the same sense of protection I'd always associated with him. "I wanted it to be a surprise," I said, laughing lightly as I stepped inside. The house felt just as I remembered, cozy and inviting, but quieter than I expected. The faint aroma of cedarwood mingled with the lingering trace of freshly brewed coffee. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows over the living room. Books were stacked neatly on side tables, their worn covers suggesting hours of his company. A glowing fireplace added warmth to the room, and the mantel was adorned with framed photos of family gatherings, holidays, and moments frozen in time. "It's been too long," Uncle Ray said, motioning for me to take a seat. "How's college life treating you?" As I began to recount stories of my final year, late nights in the library, campus events, and the chaos of graduation. He sat across from me, listening intently. His eyes would meet mine every so often, his gaze carrying an attentiveness that felt both reassuring and grounding. I noticed the slight lines around his eyes, evidence of years that had passed since our last proper conversation. "You've really grown up," he said softly after I'd finished sharing a story about a memorable professor. His tone carried an air of pride, and I couldn't help but smile. I looked around the room, letting the quiet warmth of the space settle over me. "The house feels different," I said after a moment. "Quieter, maybe?" He nodded, his expression briefly clouding over. "Lydia's been away on a retreat for a while now. It's just me here these days." He gestured toward the fireplace. "Keeps me company." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, but it was heavy with unspoken things. I thought about how much I'd missed spending time with him, how he'd always been my favorite uncle, the one who seemed to understand me without words, who could make even the simplest moments feel special. "I miss this," I admitted, my voice soft. His smile returned, brighter this time. "Me too." Later that evening, as we sat down for dinner, the house seemed to come alive with our laughter. He told me stories about the woods behind the house, about a recent fishing trip gone hilariously wrong, and about the neighbors who always seemed to have a new pet wandering onto his property. The way he spoke, animated and full of life, made me feel like a kid again, hanging on his every word. After dinner, we moved to the living room, where the fire crackled softly in the background. I curled up on the couch, feeling a warmth that wasn't just from the flames. Uncle Ray sat in his chair, his posture relaxed as he flipped through an old photo album he'd pulled from a nearby shelf. He showed me pictures of our family over the years, holiday gatherings, summer barbecues, and even a few embarrassing childhood snapshots of me. "I kept this one because you were so proud of that dress," he said, pointing to a photo of me at 7 years old, grinning from ear to ear in a bright red Christmas dress. His laugh was soft, filled with nostalgia. The hours slipped away as we talked, the conversation flowing effortlessly. Every now and then, his gaze would drift toward me as I spoke, his eyes carrying a mixture of fondness and curiosity. It was as if he were rediscovering the little girl he used to know in the grown woman sitting before him. As I climbed into bed that night in the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling of how surreal it was to be back here, reconnecting with someone who had been such a constant presence in my life. The house may have been quiet, but it felt alive in a way that words couldn't quite describe. Little did I know, This visit was only the beginning of something far more unexpected than I could have imagined. It was 2 days into my stay when Uncle Ray fell ill. The change came suddenly. He was quieter at breakfast, his usual energy replaced by fatigue. By midday, he had retreated to the couch, pale and shivering, his robust demeanor giving way to an unsettling vulnerability. I didn't hesitate to step in, assuming the role of caregiver in a way that felt both instinctive and natural. I brewed tea in the cozy kitchen, the soft whistle of the kettle breaking the quiet. Returning to the living room, I found him lying on the couch, his arm draped over his forehead. The sight of him like that tugged at me. Uncle Ray, the man who had always seemed larger than life, suddenly looked fragile. "You need to drink this," I said, placing the steaming mug on the table beside him. I sat on the edge of the couch, folding a damp cloth and pressing it gently to his forehead. "You're a terrible patient, you know," I teased, trying to lighten the moment. His chuckle was faint but genuine. "And you're surprisingly bossy for someone fresh out of college," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the day wore on, I found myself constantly checking on him, adjusting blankets, refilling his tea, and bringing him small meals. He tried to protest at first, insisting he was fine, but eventually, he accepted my help with quiet gratitude. His eyes seemed to follow me as I moved around the room, a soft appreciation evident in his expression. He didn't say much, but the way he looked at me spoke volumes. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I settled into the armchair across from him. The fireplace cast a warm glow over the room, and the rhythmic crackle of the logs filled the silence between us. "Why didn't you tell me you were feeling sick?" I asked, folding my arms. He sighed, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Didn't want to ruin your visit," he admitted. I shook my head, a small smile of my own forming. "You're impossible, you know that?" He didn't reply, just looked at me with a softness that made my chest ache. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a quiet gratitude, perhaps, or the simple relief of not being alone. The next morning, he seemed a little stronger. His color had returned, and he even managed a small breakfast. As he sipped his tea, he glanced at me over the rim of the cup. "You've been taking good care of me," he said, his voice steadier than the day before. I shrugged, trying to downplay it. "You'd do the same for me." He smiled, setting the cup down. "Still, thank you." By the third day, his energy had improved noticeably, and he insisted on sitting outside on the porch to enjoy the fresh air. I brought out a blanket and draped it over his lap, ignoring his protests that he didn't need it. "You're worse than Lydia," he muttered, though there was no malice in his tone. "Someone has to keep you in line," I shot back, settling into the chair beside him. We sat in companionable silence for a while, the stillness of the countryside stretching out around us. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached for my hand, his grip warm and reassuring. "I don't think I've thanked you enough," he said softly. I smiled, squeezing his hand. "You don't have to." But then, in a moment that caught me completely off guard, he leaned closer, pressing a brief kiss to my lips. It was warm and tender, full of gratitude and something deeper that neither of us put into words. I froze for a second, unsure of how to respond, but his embrace followed, pulling me into a hug that felt comforting and safe. I didn't know how it all happened, but at this point I didn't know how it all happened, but knew ended doing it. I felt bad, but it happened. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he murmured, his voice just above a whisper. I didn't pull away, instead resting my head on his shoulder. "You'll be fine," I said softly. "But I'm glad I'm here." The porch, the warmth of his presence, and the quiet hum of the evening all felt suspended in time, marking a connection that had deepened in ways I hadn't expected. It was a moment of shared vulnerability and care, one that neither of us would forget. On a cool Tuesday morning, with Uncle Ray feeling more like himself, we packed up for a camping trip. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and fresh earth as we made our way into the woods. Tall trees stretched above us, their leaves rustling softly in the breeze. Excitement bubbled in my chest, It had been years since I'd gone camping, and being here with Uncle Ray felt special in a way I couldn't quite explain. By the lake, he handed me a fishing rod and patiently began showing me the basics. My attempts were clumsy at first, the reel slipping from my hands and nearly falling into the water. He chuckled softly, stepping in to guide me. "Hold the rod steady," he said, his hands gently covering mine as he adjusted my grip. I glanced at him and grinned. "I think the fish are mocking us. They know we don't belong here." He laughed, but his eyes stayed on me a moment too long, his gaze thoughtful and intent. I noticed it then, how often he looked at me, his attention lingering as though he were trying to memorize every detail. Even when I turned back to the water, I could feel it. "Something on your mind?" I asked, half joking, trying to break the silence. He quickly shifted his focus back to the water, clearing his throat. "Just thinking how grown up you are now," he said, his voice low. The hours passed with laughter and lighthearted banter. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the lake in hues of orange and pink, we packed up our things and returned to the campsite. The fire crackled warmly between us as the night set in, its golden light casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. "This is nice," he said, his voice breaking the quiet. I didn't realize how much I needed this. I smiled at him, poking at the fire with a stick. "Maybe you just needed the right company." He looked at me then, his expression open and unguarded. I could feel his eyes on me again, the intensity of his attention making my chest tighten. He reached out, brushing a stray leaf from my hair, his hand pausing for just a moment before retreating. Without thinking, he leaned in, and our lips met in a kiss that was warm and unspoken in its meaning. When we pulled back, the fire continued to crackle, but the quiet between us was filled with a depth I hadn't noticed before. As we sat together under the starlit sky, I realized how much this trip would mean to me, a memory that would stay etched in my heart forever. The warmth of the campfire wrapped around us as the evening deepened, the sounds of the forest creating a serene backdrop. Uncle Ray leaned back in his chair, his face calm but thoughtful, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows across his features. I poked at the fire with a stick, content in the peaceful silence that stretched between us. "This has been good," he said finally, his voice breaking through the quiet. "Being out here reminds me of simpler times." I nodded, smiling. It's been nice to step away from everything for a bit. The tranquility of the moment was suddenly shattered by a low, guttural growl that sent chills racing up my spine. My eyes darted toward the sound, and there it was, a massive bear emerging from the shadows, its dark figure illuminated by the flickering firelight. My breath caught in my throat as fear gripped me. Uncle Ray was on his feet in an instant. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice steady and firm. He grabbed a flaming log from the fire, holding it out like a shield. The bear growled again, its powerful frame unmoving as it stared us down. "Get back!" Uncle Ray shouted, waving the log to keep the animal at bay. His stance was strong, protective, every movement deliberate. The tension was palpable, each second stretching out as he held his ground. I stayed frozen in place, my heart pounding as I watched him. Despite the danger, his focus was split between the bear and me, his eyes darting back to ensure I was safe. His bravery was undeniable, and, even in the chaos, I felt a strange sense of security knowing he was there. After what felt like an eternity, the bear finally backed away, disappearing into the darkness with a final huff. Uncle Ray didn't lower the log until he was sure it was gone. When he turned back to me, his expression softened, the adrenaline fading from his face. "You okay?" he asked, his voice quieter now. I nodded, my legs still shaky. "I think so," I managed to say, my voice trembling slightly. He stepped closer, his gaze scanning me for any sign of harm. When he was sure I was unscathed, he reached out, pulling me into a firm hug. The warmth of his embrace steadied me, and I felt a wave of relief wash over me. "We should pack up and head home," he said after a moment, his voice resolute. We worked quickly to gather our things, the earlier piece of the campsite replaced by an urgent need to leave. The drive back was quiet, the events of the night still fresh in my mind. I couldn't shake the image of Uncle Ray standing between me and the bear, his courage shining through in the face of danger. When we finally reached the house, exhaustion settled over both of us. He placed a comforting hand on my shoulder as we stepped inside, his touch grounding me. "Get some rest," he said softly. "You've had a long night." I nodded, giving him a small smile before heading to the guest room. As I lay in bed, the events of the evening played over in my mind, the fear, the adrenaline, and most of all, the unshakable sense of safety I'd felt with Uncle Ray. His actions had been more than brave. They had spoken of a deep care that I couldn't ignore. The night had taken an unexpected turn, but in its wake, I felt closer to him than ever. The bond we shared had grown stronger, forged in the fire of a moment neither of us would soon forget. The events from the woods and the bear attack stayed in my mind briefly, but I was glad Uncle Ray had protected me. His bravery in the face of danger had made me feel safe in a way I hadn't expected. Later that night, back at home, the fire burned low, casting a soft glow around the room as the chill of the evening settled in. We sat close, wrapped in blankets, the quiet of the house surrounding us. Uncle Ray looked at me, his expression soft and thoughtful. "Thank you for being here," he said quietly, his voice filled with warmth and sincerity. Slowly, he reached out, pulling me close, his arm around me offering a sense of comfort I couldn't ignore. I smiled, resting my head on his shoulder. "You'd survive without me, but it wouldn't be as fun," I said lightly, trying to ease the weight of the moment. He chuckled softly, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity. Without a word, he leaned in and kissed me, his lips warm and tender against mine. He then lifted me up, guiding me to the kitchen. Then it happened. My uncle knelt down in front of me while I watched him slowly doing his thing. Yes, we did. It was great. It was lovely. The gesture carried an unspoken depth, and as he held me close in his arms, the bond between us deepened, creating a moment I knew would stay with me forever. The final day of my visit arrived, and the weight of everything that had happened during my stay hung heavily in my heart. The morning was quiet, the house wrapped in an unusual stillness. Uncle Ray moved about calmly, his presence steady as always, but I couldn't ignore the mix of emotions swirling inside me. Guilt and confusion gnawed at me, weaving through the cherished memories we'd created. I packed my things slowly, replaying moments from the visit in my mind, the laughter, the shared adventures, and the moments of connection that felt so profound. Yet, those memories were now tinged with a heaviness I couldn't shake. What had seemed like simple affection had turned into something far more complicated, and I wasn't sure how to reconcile it. At the door, I turned to him, hesitating before throwing my arms around him in a hug. "Take care of yourself," I said softly, my voice trembling slightly as I struggled to hide my inner turmoil. He held me tightly for a moment, his voice quiet. "You too, kiddo. Don't wait so long to visit next time." I nodded, offering a small smile before heading to the car. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing him standing at the doorway. The distance between us grew, but the weight of what had happened stayed with me, a mix of regret and understanding settling in my chest. It was a visit I knew I'd never forget, but it was one that left me questioning so much about myself and the bond we shared. Now, I want to hear from you. What do you think about this confession? How would you handle the emotions and decisions that come with such an experience? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think about where this story could go next. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what happens next. Trust me, there's more to come, and it's not what you're expecting. What will the future hold for Uncle Ray and me? Let's dive deeper into the aftermath of this visit together. Stay tuned for the next chapter. It's going to be one you won't want to miss.